This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to episode 216 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's sponsor is Private Internet Access. If you've ever surfed the web and wanted to do it securely, especially when you're traveling or using someone else's network, you definitely need private internet access. Private internet access allows you to have a secure VPN without them logging what data what you're doing, what transactions you're making, or anything like that, to connect to anywhere in the world. You can also change your default location so it appears as if you're coming from a different place. Why is this helpful, you say? If you're not doing anything nefarious, well, it's really helpful if you want to test DNS resolution from different places and different time zones. It's a really cool tool, and it's not very expensive at all. You can get plans starting at $3.99 a month, and you can find out more by going to geekleader.com/VPN. Again, that's geekleader.com/VPN. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, I have Steve Chaparro, and he is an organizational and cultural expert and a communicator who speaks worldwide to companies on how they can transform their workplace culture. And today, I want to be talking to him about how to build good team culture and what we need to do to help develop and maintain a good culture in this post-pandemic world that we're all living in. And we've all probably had some kind of struggles as we've gone through that, but we'll get into all that later. With all that being said, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Been looking forward to our conversation. Appreciate it.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about how you got to where you are today and kind of what you're doing today.
Yeah, it definitely is a topic of conversation when folks realize that I got my start in architecture, and they just don't understand the connection of how someone who studied and worked in the field of architecture for 10 years is now in the area of culture. But I definitely, there is a thread line through it all. I started to realize at the last role that I had as a VP of Strategic Design at a national firm. In fact, we had an office there in Charlotte where you're at for quite a while. And what we were really passionate about was what we called spatial storytelling. And we wanted to really understand what was the cultural narrative of that particular client organization. And then we felt that our task was to either shape or embody that or have the physical space serve to shape or embody that narrative. Say, for instance, if you've said that you were a culture of, you had a culture of collaboration, what were the types of spaces that helped to facilitate that type of interaction or activity? That was our task, so that the workspace was in many essences a branded environment of their cultural values. But what I started to understand and really what I noted in that sort of work was that many of the organizations that we worked with truly did not have a good understanding of what that narrative was to be. Either one, they could articulate it very well aspirationally and say, this is who we want to be, but very much said it as if that's what they were. But there was a misalignment between who they said they were and what the actual experience was within the organization, whether it was the experience of their clients or more importantly, the experience of their employees. So I became very passionate about really looking at the cultural environment, the design of the organization, in some cases the shaping of the culture, and how could I use my experience in architecture or in design to help take folks through a framework to really understand and shape what their culture was to be. So I founded Culture Design Studio, which is really kind of taking that those two disciplines of design and organizational culture, putting them together and really leading clients through that process. So rather than acting as a management consultant who comes in as a subject matter expert, I'm really coming in as a process architect and really leading folks through that process so that they can develop their own insights as a collaborative and co-creative process.
So how important is it for a company to kind of build their own culture by going through that process versus just, saying, oh, I really like what Netflix is doing, I want to steal that?
Yeah, there's definitely never going to be a one size fits all. There's never going to be a plug and play. You're always going to find challenges, and I think that's what happens many times. Is you have these leaders, they either read a book or they go to a conference, and they come back so excited because they heard about this model that was so successful,
Mhm.
and they come back and want to just essentially, I mean, even maybe in some ways benevolently shove things down the throats of their team through this model that was not necessarily tailored for them. You have to understand that even that Netflix cultural model, it evolved. It took many years for it to get there, and so what we see as the outcome of 20 years of work, we think of it as a plug and play model. And they, or any company who does have any sort of success as a culture, would probably admit to you wholeheartedly that that came as a result of many iterations, many bumps and bruises, and even some mistakes to arrive at was maybe their winning formula. But that winning formula is not necessarily you put in all the ingredients and boom, out comes this wonderful culture. It's literally this iterative process. And so I do think, to your question, that it is fantastically important for organizations to go through the brain damage, if you will. If you want to put it in birthing terms, the travail of birthing what that culture will be, because there's no way to outsource what that will look like. You have to go through the process.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that too. I've been at places um, where they've seen a culture that they liked, and they just said, "Hey, let's just copy that, and let's just say we're going to follow this." And I think at the time it was like Zappos; they wanted it to be a
Yeah.
Zappos type culture. And literally, I remember sitting in the meeting where somebody from our HR group was flipping through the Zappos culture slide deck, and it even still had the Zappos logo on it. Talking about how we're going to
Yeah.
do this the way that
Yeah.
Zappos does it. And I just get, for me, it just felt so disgenuine. It felt so
Yeah.
unreal. And I think it's what you're talking about at the beginning, how you see that disconnect between what people say they are and what they really are.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's okay to study those companies as case studies. I think case studies are fine because you can take some learnings,
Yeah.
but I really cringe with the term of using them as models,
Mm-hmm.
because whenever we take a model, we want to take their form. And even going back to my architecture days, anytime you had a model, it was literally a physical representation of an idea. And so if you take on that model in its current form and just try to plug and play, you're not going to learn from it. So I do think it's disingenuous, but I do think it can be authentic to say, let's look at the case study as an example of Zappos. What
Mm-hmm.
are some things that we can learn from them that ring true with who we are? But I really do think that a company needs to go through the process of really discovering who it is that they are, and knowing that who they are will continue to evolve as they grow.
So, what is this basic process? I know you do a lot for companies and organizations, but what if we wanted to break this down to like a team? Maybe you're a manager of a software development team, or you're an IT director, or a network security team, and you want to kind of define your team's culture, figure out what it is, and how can we play to the strengths of this, and what is that process like? How does that start?
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed recently, as it relates to culture, is a lot of times companies won't reach out to you, like say myself, because I do a lot of work in partnership with Nobel Collective as well, NOBL. They are a very well known organizational change and organizational design agency. And one of the things that both in their work and in my work, realizing that many times culture is not necessarily the primary problem that a team generally wants to solve. There's usually some other thing that they want to solve, whether it's we need to work better or we need to change that we're structured so that we can scale more to the future. And so they don't necessarily say, we want you to come in and help us change our culture, even though sometimes that is the directive. I would say, even though that's probably, in my view, the primary outcome, it's not necessarily the primary objective, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think if you solve some of these underlying issues, by virtue of solving some of those underlying issues, like how are we structured, how are decisions made, what types of tools and things do we offer our employees, how do we collaborate, all of those things, you inevitably will change the culture. But it just, but to answer your question, let's say if someone did say, I want to change the culture of my organization, there's different scales that I would definitely encourage a leader to look at. I think number one, there's a culture of one, and that is the culture within that specific leader. And what is the change does that particular leader need to make in their own life, in their own leadership style, in the way that they're doing things? Because if you want change, change will begin at the top. And if we're talking about a team, it's at the top of that team. And so really looking at some of the ways that a leader, and that's where a lot of my work comes in, is coaching these creative visionaries who understand that sometimes their vision turns into frustration when they're met with resistance. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what I'm helping people do at an individual leader level is gain the self-awareness about what some of their blind spots are so that they are prepared to lead change in their team. But let's say we move beyond that. I think the first part is really going into the first stage of what I would call framing the problem. And if it's all under the theme of culture, then it's really trying to understand what in fact is the problem. I think too many times folks will enter in these types of discussions believing that they already know what the problem is. Yep. They may think that it's even culture, but there's deeper issues, right? It's not just culture. There are more
specific culture kind things. Of like a result of those problems, those deeper problems sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it's how you communicate, how do you lead, how are decisions made, how do we reward, what do we reward? What do we, in a sense, punish? It's really culture when you think about it. It's just how things are done at a specific place. Obviously, there's a ton of things associated with that. But when a leader says, "I want to improve how things are done in our team," then you're speaking to this overarching question of culture, and there's so much to it. But I think really going into it and saying, I'm not going to rely on a management consultant to tell me what's wrong. I'm not going to rely on even myself, my own understanding, even if some people say I'm the smartest person in the room. I really believe that the greatest genius is really going to be by asking people, getting feedback. So surveys, one-on-one conversations, and really trying to arrive at what are the challenges that are rising to the top. What are the themes that are rising to the top? And then once those themes, let's say there's 10 themes, well then what can we do to prioritize which themes or which challenges we can address in, say, the next 6 months? And then going out and really enlisting people to give ideas of how can we resolve some of these things, and then doing some pilots on how to address those specific areas. And then getting feedback all throughout, and consider this as very much an iterative process that will continue to evolve as you address more and more issues.
So help me here. Like, let's say I want to figure out what's going on with my team. I want to figure out what the real problems are, because I know there's some, as a leader, sometimes you feel like something's just not right. You don't know exactly what it is or how to get there. And you have one-on-ones, you try to schedule stuff, but how do you get people to really open up and really share that? Is that even possible if you're the leader conducting these, or do you need?
Well, yeah. Well, I think number one, a leader needs to show their own vulnerability, their own. You say, you know what? I'm sensing that there's something that could be better in our culture, and it's my responsibility as a leader to make sure that I do my part and understand that I probably have blind spots. And here are some of the things that I'm concerned about, not necessarily in a punitive way, but like I'm concerned that maybe I'm not leading in the way that I should, or maybe there's something that I need to do. I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go through a process where I have to show up in a vulnerable way. And I think modeling the vulnerability that you desire is first and foremost. And that's really hard for some people. Because if you want people to open up, you have to also consider, if it is hard for people to open up, you have to really look long and hard as to whether or not you as a leader have created a psychologically safe environment where people feel that they can speak up, where they can push back, where they can disagree and not be punished or not, receive some sort of pushback as a result. And if people aren't responding in that way, then you need to look at yourself as a leader to say, how can I better provide or shape a safe place where people can speak up? Because that's on you as a leader. And I'm speaking whoever this leader is. That is on you to make sure that you have created a space where psychologically safety is in existence. And if it isn't, maybe that's where you need to start.
Mm-hmm. So let's say that I am a leader and I'm having these conversations and I don't feel like people are opening up. What can I do to make sure that I am giving that safe space? Because sometimes you don't realize how intimidating you're being. And I'll give you an example from my own life. When I started a new company several years ago, I was in charge of their technology group, and I started having one-on-ones. And I found that people would come in to my office and sit down and have these one-on-ones, and they always were very surface level. I never could get deep, even when I tried. And what I ended up having to do is to kind of really take us out of this environment. I started doing walking one-on-ones. That was one of the things that I did just to get out of my office, because having to come to the boss's office is always intimidating, So how can we get out of that? And then I started, like you said, being vulnerable, trying to open up, talk about things outside of work, spend the entire conversation talking about not work stuff, and let people know that I'm a person and I care about their outside of work stuff as much as I do about their in work stuff. And that helped me kind of break down those barriers. But is there other practical tips that we can do?
Yeah, I think there's some major things you can do, and then there are those small things or kind of like tactical things like you described of one-on-ones, walking one-on-ones, sharing your own vulnerability in meetings. I think it can be some pretty major things like doing 360 reviews, where you're really asking folks to evaluate you. Sometimes in an anonymous way. I really like the idea of having someone kind of create a series of questions so that they can interview your team, so that person who's doing the interviewing can come back. Because yes, I believe the quantitative multiple choice types of 360s are good, but I think probably the qualitative is even better, because when they give a response, whoever's interviewing them can follow up with deeper, like follow-up questions that go deeper and deeper into the issue. And especially if you want to focus on how can I create a safe place for people to speak up, speak their mind, push back, and questions can be all centered around that. So it doesn't have to be the formal 360 that gets shot to them via email to this automated system. It could be very qualitative, where they're asking open-ended questions, and then that person can come back with some results and see what those themes are, and then you could address it with the team and say, okay, everybody, thank you for your feedback. All your feedback was anonymous. Like, I don't know who gave what, not, but here are the themes, and I acknowledge that these are the themes that I need to work on in order to make this a safe place. And you have my commitment, and you have the authority to keep me accountable. Like if I'm not doing something, let's talk on the side and let's address it. If it shows up that I'm not addressing something that I committed to. Now that takes courage, that takes vulnerability in order to do that. And so I think it definitely is a process, and sometimes, yeah. So I think those are some things to think about.
Yeah, for sure. I think so let's say we've gone through this, we've figured out some problems, we've done some interviews, we've got people to kind of open up, and we want to pilot some of this. You mentioned piloting some activities. What are some processes in that, and how do you measure the outcomes of these pilots?
Yeah, I think there can be pilots that speak to different things. It might be that somebody says, or the theme that comes out of it is, we don't have a clear path for our careers. Like, I don't understand what my upward mobility might be, or it might be, work-life balance, or it might be decision making, any one of those things. And so I think there can even be I'm a big fan, a big proponent of design thinking, where you could do even a design sprint where it's a workshop over a short period of time that intends to really come up with in a co-creative way what might be that pilot program that you can prototype and then test it to get feedback. And so the idea is, what can you do to create change in a small, contained, focused area so that you can build it, not fully build it out, because I think too many times folks will build out these full programs only to find out that number one, did not address the right problem, did not really come up with a good solution that was based on feedback from the end users, even if it's an internal cultural challenge, and then fully, built it out way too big, or too far along the process, and then didn't get feedback along the way. It's kind of like, ta-da, here it is. We built this new program. We addressed the problem that you challenged. Yes, we didn't consult you. No, we didn't get any prototype. No, we didn't get any feedback. We just believe we know what you guys need. And so here it is. And only to find out that the program failed because it was built in a vacuum.
Yeah. And you see that a lot. You use that in tech. Like we write in software, sometimes we'll write software in a vacuum as well. And it always seems to be a disaster.
Yeah. Well, so, being in tech, so about this whole, the lean methodology. Yeah. The lean startup, where you build this minimal viable product, where you kind of release the program or the product in its most crude way, just to be able to get feedback. Like the whole idea of a minimal viable product is not to necessarily launch a finished product. Far from it. It's really with the intention of getting feedback, so that you can either add features or remove features that no longer worked. And it's the same thing with some of these policies or some of these programs, is what can you do to make it an iterative program that really does solve the problem, and it minimizes risks, it minimizes wasted money, and actually it engages the employees when you include them in the process. I think that's the greatest thing. So, like, say if it's one of these specific areas, like say work-life balance, and you include people in the process of determining what this will look like, they do become more engaged. They do become there's a higher sense of ownership, and honestly, the innovation of that program will be far greater than if you had actually built it in stealth mode.
Yep, absolutely. And so with this whole, all these changes that have happened in 2020 and 2021 so far, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen when it comes to, developing a culture or maintaining a culture with all the different things that have changed, because we're living in a totally different world than we were in, 2015.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of the companies that I speak to are creative type of organizations, whether they're design led or they're actual creative organizations, design firms, architecture, whatever. And I know that a lot of them, some of the leaders that I talked to early in the pandemic were really struggling to trust their people. Because there is this sense of craft in the creative world, that the end product, the craft of the end product, is so important. And so a lot of these leaders have become successful because of their mastery of the craft and because of their attention to detail. But what this has resulted in, if it's not handled well, is micromanagement. And being able to peer over the shoulder of some of their teammates while they were in the office pre-pandemic was just the way that they worked. And so when you were no longer able to do that virtually or remotely, you weren't sure if people were actually doing the work, if they were doing it properly, if they were spending, their proper amount of time. Because in the world of, design agencies, design firms, utilization of their hours for billable hours, productivity per billable hour is so important. And so trust was a major thing that folks were struggling with, and that was actually resulting in their inability to control things, inability to just peer over things, and so that resulted, that lack of control, in a lot of anxiety. And so I think really trying to understand or rather develop trust in your people, understanding that outcomes is most important. Who cares if someone was working from 8 to 5 with a 60-minute lunch? If they preferred to work early, if they preferred to work late, but they got the job done, either day by day or week over week, then that's all that really mattered. But so I think that was really hard for a lot of people to address. So that's one area. I mean, even the area of having that work-life balance even worsen, because people's days were blurring because they have their office like I do in my bedroom. And so being able to pop on at 7 o'clock and then pop off at 7 o'clock, it was very easy. And before you know it, you're working much harder than you did pre-pandemic. So putting in some guardrails, for people to honor their physical and emotional and intellectual health was really important to address.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest things I had with my team. Like when we went from being in the office to being remote, was to tell people, hey, you don't have to work all the time. Like, I know it feels like you're at work, because you're at home, but don't respond after hours. And I have to kind of give them that ability to just be straight and frank with them and say, look, I'm not expecting you to respond, and I don't want you to respond. I want you to have that break, because I'm not getting the best you if you're on all the time.
What's interesting? Yeah, what's interesting is that there in some of these major companies that we're working with, where like say they have functional areas, whether it's in marketing or something, they have teams that are say upwards of 100 people, or even organizations that have 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 people. What we started to hear is, yes, there was a desire on behalf of leaders to establish a culture that did take into consideration mental and emotional and physical health of their employees, and wanted to institute some of those things. But many times they were the worst modelers of the behavior they were trying to promote.
Yeah.
And so they, these are folks that were emailing their team at over the weekend or late into the night. And so they were just telling people, you know what, I want you to not do this, but I'm going to do it. But don't do as I say and not as I do. And so that was another thing too, is like coming in and seeing some of that was happening. And so that's been something that was been very interesting to see, even during this time.
Yeah. And, I used to have that problem too, where I would send emails like at 8 or 9 o'clock and then tell people not to respond. They're like, well, I feel like I have to because my boss is emailing.
Yeah.
So what I ended up doing is just I stopped sending any after hours emails. Even if I was working, I'm going to save it. I'm going to save it as a draft, send it in the morning.
Yeah.
And because I can't put that pressure on people to think that they have to respond.
Yeah.
And tell them that they don't. It's like sending mixed signals there.
Right. And so on one hand, if you really do, I'm just speaking metaphorically to anybody, if a leader really does want to be able to send emails out and wants to be true and wants to promote a culture that they work into the evening or early in the morning, that's fine. But just make sure everything that you're saying is in alignment with what you're doing.
Right.
Everything that you're expecting of people, that it's in alignment with what you're doing. And so it's really about alignment. So if it's a super hardcore work environment where people are burning the candle at both ends, fine. Then that's what it is. I'm not saying it's healthy or not. That's a judgment call on everyone's behalf. But make sure that what you're saying is in alignment with what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think having that cohesion between what you're saying and what you're doing is very important. And I know for me, it's one of those things like when I go on vacation, I'm on vacation. My phone's during the day when I'm on vacation, I'm not answering my phone. Now, when my kids go to bed and I'm sitting in bed, I'll check up on emails. I'll respond to things. But, and it's taken, honestly, probably 2 years for my team to really get to that point, because the manager before me was never on vacation.
Yeah.
To kind of get to the point where saying, hey, when John's gone, John's gone. And when we're gone, we need to be gone too.
Yeah.
And he's not
Yeah.
going to ask me. Like if I see somebody's on vacation, I'm not going to ask them. And if I see them jump online on Teams or Slack or something when they're on vacation, I'm going to say, "Hey, you're on vacation."
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the accountability comes in, right? The accountability is both ways. And I think that even goes to a lot of companies, or especially in the summer. But even if it's not just a summer thing, it's just a new way of working where they're having, like, say, no meeting Fridays.
Yeah.
Well, then have no meetings. Like, do not break the rule. Don't try to have this off calendar meeting just because you don't want people to see it. It gets out, and it's just a demonstration of whether we do really believe that these things are important. I understand that there's going to be emergencies here and there, and I think they should be called out as emergencies or one-off cases, because you don't want to be so legalistic about it. But I think those should be called out as exceptions rather than the rules.
Yeah. And I think it's okay. Like you said, if you do have to make an exception, but you need to be transparent about that this is an
Yeah.
exception and clear about it, not just try to hide it. Because I think that's when people get in the most trouble is when they try to sneak something in or try to just like, creep it one way or the other. And it always messes
Right.
up.
Yeah.
So what other big topics about, company culture, and one of the challenges that I have, just to be frank with you, is when you have a team that's split, a hybrid team. So I have some people in the office and some people remote. How do you maintain a good company culture? Because a lot of things happen offline. When you're walking down the hall and you meet somebody, or you people just gather into the conference room and chat, or have start playing some game or something in the break room, and everybody just joins in, and the people that are offline, kind of get left out. How do we make
Yeah.
sure that they're not left out, and to include them, and how do we make that top of mind? Because a lot of times it's just you just don't think about it.
Right. I mean, the hybrid phenomenon is prevalent. I mean, it actually exists across all different realms, and I say realms because it's whether you have a hybrid office, or you have a hybrid event, or you have anything that's hybrid. It's really hard to do both equally well.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you focus on one, it's going to seem as if you're neglecting the other. And that's part of it. And I think to be open and transparent, that there is that dynamic that it will seem at any one given moment, any snapshot of time, there will be one of the two that might feel I wouldn't say less than, but just less focused on. And so I think number one is just being really upfront and frank that is the case. That will be the case here and there. However, it should be the exception and not the rule. And so I think really trying to make it, just really be considerate about making every meeting. Because let's say for you have a meeting and you have half of the people in the room and half people on the screen. Well, who is it that you're going to be making eye contact with? That's a major decision if you think about it.
Yeah.
Because if you make eye contact with those that are in the room and not the screen, well, who's going to be feel left out? It's those that are there virtually. But if you just are looking at your camera all the time, and you got these people who are in the room with you and you're not making eye contact with them, they're like, oh my God, like, why are we even here if he's just going to be looking at the screen? And so I think being able to just be conscious, if you're going to do that, is try to make everyone have the same experience. And there can be a variety of different ways. One, you do make eye contact with both groups equally. Or you can even say this is going to be a video first, where literally everyone in the room, even if they're there physically, are going to have their laptops open. And that way everybody can see everybody's face on the screen. There are different things that can happen. But I also think that it's a mistake to necessarily try to replicate the in-office experience virtually. I think they have to find their own personality and their own trait. Like, say, if you have, like, what are you going to do? Have a virtual water cooler?
Yeah.
That people
I
are
agree
just going to pop
100%.
into a Zoom meeting just to see, was anybody here? Is anybody standing around?
Yeah, I've done so many virtual like beer tastings and stuff, and it's always a little awkward, a little weird. Some of them are fun, but a lot of times it's just like you're missing something because it's not real.
Yeah,
But I
and
agree
I
with you.
think
You got to do something separate.
all of those are noble, and I'm not saying not to try those things. I'm just saying it has to be an experiment to its own,
Yeah.
where you try different things, but not necessarily try to replicate exactly. Like there's no way, like say for an event, a concert, a conference, there's no way to replicate the in-person experience. It has to be different. You have to make it just memorable in its own right. But yes, the hybrid model is a challenge, and I do think that it's probably more of a challenge than people think,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not thinking it through. But they almost have to ask, how can I make this meeting, how can I make this event the best experience for those that are present, as well as for those that are here virtually, and they're going to be very different considerations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've done is, I have like my infrastructure team. They're all on site. So when we meet now, we meet in person. We're back to that point, which we had our first one last week, which is pretty cool to meet in person. But some other teams that I have are split. They're hybrid. So when we do those team meetings, I do them 100% virtual. So everybody stays in their office or at their cubes, and we do them virtual because we don't want to.
Yeah.
I've been trying to intentionally not let the person that or the people that are remote be left out.
Right.
And so it is a little bit challenging from time to time to remember those things. But I think as a leader, you have to be intentional.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I think what I've seen some companies do very successfully is even for those folks that are working remotely, that if it's possible for you to bring them in either on a quarterly basis or even a monthly basis, whatever the time being might be, and that may or may not be possible given on where everybody's at. But maybe it's 1 or 2 times a year where everybody comes in and there is actual everybody's together in person. I have noticed that yes, I do believe fast friendships and relationships can happen virtually. I've witnessed it. I've been a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that camaraderie will skyrocket when you bring them in, whether it's once, twice, or 4 times a year.
Yeah.
Because they're able to take that virtual relationship to in person, and it just does so many wonders. And if you think about it, okay, the cost of that 1, 2, or however many trips, you might say, well, I saved that money because I didn't have to house them. And so there's different ways of looking at it, of how you can rationalize spending the money to bring people in. But I think that the payoff from a cultural perspective is huge, and I think that'll pay off in the bottom line in the long run.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. So, Steve, man, I really appreciate having you on the show. How can people find out more about the things that you're doing, your company, and connect with you offline?
Yeah, I mean, I have a fantastic course that I've put together. It's an audio course.
Mm-hmm.
It's 5 days, and it's really about helping frustrated leaders turn their frustrations into foundations for change. So it's 5 days that's sent to your email. You listen to the lesson for the day, then you have some daily activities or homework based on that. And I think that's a really great way for people to just be introduced to some of the things that I think about and work on with individual leaders as well as companies. Mm-hmm. So if they are interested in that, they can go to stevechaparro.co/frustrated. stevechaparro.co/frustrated, and Chaparro is 1 P and 2 R's. All right, and then they can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
All right, I'm going to link that up in the show notes at geekleader.com so people can connect there. I also link your website and LinkedIn so people can connect to you if they just go to geekleader.com as well. Steve, again, thanks so much for being on the show. I greatly appreciate it. I feel like I learned a lot.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.